Hello friends! Today awaits us an incredible story of the German mountaineer Heinrich Harrer. This is one of those cases where a person's biography is capable of surpassing the script of any adventure movie. And let's start, as usual, from far off with the north face of the Eiger. To put it briefly, the Eiger north face is an immense and challenging wall, sometimes with a negative gradient. It was nicknamed the Death Wall by the people. The mountain regularly claimed the lives of climbers. Perhaps the most notorious tragedy occurred there in 1936 when four climbers, Tony Kurtz, Andreas Hinterstoicer, Willy Angera, and Eddie Rayner, died a terrible death on the wall. Moreover, Tony Kurtz was hanging on the rope just a few meters from rescue. The story had an incredibly strong resonance in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the entire mountaineering community at large. In the 1930s, mountaineering was at the peak of its popularity. It was just emerging and enticed everyone, even those who knew little about the mountains. However, climbing the north face of the Eiger was temporarily banned, and the wall was considered impossible. But this ban was short-lived, lasting only a year, and soon attempts to ascend began again, but still unsuccessfully. In 1937, Italians and several Austrian groups tried to storm the wall, but all attempts failed. And finally, a turning point occurred when in June 1938, 26-year-old Austrian climber Heinrich Harrer and his friend Fritz Kasperek, with whom they had agreed in winter to jointly storm the Eiger north face, arrived at the wall. Heinrich Harrer had just graduated from the geophysics department of the university, where he studied geography and physical education, while actively engaging in mountaineering and skiing. Undoubtedly, he was a very strong athlete, and in 1936 even participated in the Olympic Games as part of the Austrian slalom team, and in 1937 became the world student champion again in slalom. During training, he met the skier Fritz Kasperek, who quickly became his friend. They practiced skiing and mountaineering together. As I already mentioned, in the 1930s, the sport was at the peak of its popularity, and many young people, at least in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, were engaged in mountaineering. By the time he finished his university courses, Heinrich Harrer had already accomplished a large number of the most difficult routes. However, it's hard to call him a professional mountaineer. In my opinion, there were guys in Austria and Germany who were stronger. Mountaineering was just emerging and transitioning from being a pastime of the eccentric aristocracy to the mountaineering we know today. Therefore, all climbers were essentially beginners. And so, in June of '38, they stood before the most difficult alpine wall at that time, dubbed the Murder Wall. The Eiger north face had already claimed the lives of many climbers. The surface was smoothed by numerous avalanches, almost entirely covered with ice, and had an average steepness of 75 degrees, and in some places, even an overhang. The high frequency of rockfalls, avalanches, and rapid weather changes made the ascent of the Eiger's north face deadly, and the more prestigious it was to conquer it. Whoever ascended the north face of the Eiger would instantly become a national hero and forever inscribe their name in the history of mountaineering. After making a training climb and leaving a backpack with supplies in a cave just above the shattered bastion, on July 21, Heinrich and Fritz set off for the decisive assault. At the base of the wall, they met two countrymen, Rudi Fries and Leo Ranowski. It was decided to try their luck on the Eiger as a foursome. Ascending to the cave, the Austrians found that it was already occupied by two other climbers resting before their climb. These were Andre Heckmeyer and Ludwig Work, and as you can understand, despite the mortal danger, this place was quite popular. As I already said, conquering the north face of the Eiger was an incredibly prestigious task. So Heckmeyer and Work, in my opinion, were already veterans of mountaineering, although they were just slightly over 30. But for the young mountaineering community of those years, they were already old-timers. Moreover, they had an incredible amount of experience with the most difficult ascents. And in my subjective view, Heckmeyer and Work, as climbers, were stronger than Harrer and Kasperek. Andre Heckmeyer worked as a gardener in Munich, I used to describe myself like this. On Sundays, I usually do some sixers and help to bring down another corpse. On Monday and Tuesday, I can work because after the climb and the bike ride, I have no strength left. On Wednesday, I have to attend the funeral of the one who died on Sunday. On Thursday and Friday, I have to conserve energy for the next trips. Of course, it's not surprising that the Munich municipality fired such a gardener. His partner, Ludwig Berg, also had a quite solid experience in climbing. In 1934, he made the first traverse of Ashba, one of the most beautiful and difficult peaks of the Caucasus. In 1936, he returned to the Caucasus and climbed North Ashba via the western wall. Moreover, it was he who a year earlier had ascended to the ramp of the Eiger and came back down alive, which was already a significant achievement. But let's return back to the Eiger, to the cave where the climbers met. As you already understand, Heckmeyer and Werk were the strongest climbers of their time. Moreover, they had very good and modern equipment. For example, 12-point crampons with front points that allowed not to use steps on some icy sections. These crampons had appeared quite recently and were an incredible breakthrough in mountaineering equipment because hewing steps took a lot of time and effort. At the same time, Harrer and Kasprek had only one pair of crampons between them, and those were of an old model. In the evening, Andre Heckmeyer looked at his barometer and saw that the pressure was dropping. Then he looked at the clouds, and he did not like them. Concluding that the weather was going to deteriorate, the Germans decided to descend, and 6 people on one wall, in their opinion, was too many. The Austrians decided to continue their assault. Setting out early in the morning, they quickly reached the Red Chimney and traversed the Hinterstoiser Traverse. It turned out that Rudi Fries had been hit by a stone on the head, and the second rope team also decided to go down. Clearly, no one wanted to repeat the mistakes of previous groups. As we remember from the ascent by Tony Kurtz, Willy Angera also was struck by a stone but continued the climb. This led to a terrible tragedy, and so the climbers Rudi Fries and Leo Vranovsky descended and will no longer appear in our story. Thus, only Heinrich Harrer and Fritz Kasperek remained on the wall. There was a rope hanging on the traverse, left there from the year before. With its help, Harrer and Kasperek quickly and effortlessly overcame this fearsome place. After snaking at the swallow's nest, they reached the first ice field. At this point, their pace of movement slowed down significantly. Since Harrer, let me remind you, did not have his own crampons, needed large steps and very reliable belaying. Nonetheless, by the afternoon, they had reached the second ice field. The second half of the day in the mountains is usually more dangerous, as rocks thawed by the sun begin to fall. The second ice field is the most hazardous for falling stones on the wall, and Harrer and Kasperek decide not to take any risks and to wait it out. They plan to set out early in the morning when stones and snow, bound by ice, lay in their places, and the danger of rockfalls and avalanches is much less. They settle in for the night on the wall. While Heinrich and Fritz were climbing the ice chute connecting the first and second ice fields, they managed to get thoroughly wet, and as they tried to sleep on their ledge, their clothes froze. But in the morning, they went down onto the second ice field. Fritz Kasperek led the way, cutting steps. It was arduous work that lasted 5 hours, and by the end of the second ice field, Kasperek was almost out of strength. And when the climbers sat down to rest, they noticed that another rope team was ascending the wall at a very high pace. It was, of course, Heckmeyer and Werg who were catching up to Kasperek and Harrer very quickly. They had descended earlier, but noticed that the weather was improving and decided to assault the wall. Thanks to the steps already cut by Kasperek and their new front point crampons, they were moving very quickly through the ice fields. And here is an interesting point. There was always a certain, unspoken rivalry between Austrians, Bavarians, and Swiss. All of them had quite strong climbers, and to ascend the last unconquered Alpine wall was prestigious for all. And purely theoretically, it can be assumed that Heckmeyer and Berg let the Austrians go ahead, as if passing the baton, to allow them to use steps for them, using up all their energy while they themselves would be fresh, full of strength, with new high-quality equipment to quickly storm the wall the next day. Meanwhile, the Austrians would have simply had no strength left. This version has never been voiced anywhere and can generally be considered just a figment of my imagination. However, the Germans suggested that the Austrians give up the ascent. In their opinion, Harrer and Kaspberg were not well enough equipped for such a wall. And this is actually true. Heinrich had no crampons, and neither of them had an ice axe. Kaspberg chiseled steps with an ice hammer, which took a great deal of strength and an incredible amount of time. Yet ahead lay the third ice field at a spot on the wall known as the White Spider. It was in the upper part of the wall and was considered impassable, but the Austrians refused to descend. In my view, unlike the Bavarians, they were motivated by more than just sporting interest. But we'll discuss the true reason for their stubbornness a bit higher up. And here occurs a very important moment. Work suggests they go as a foursome. I don't know what exactly was discussed on the wall, but in the end, the two road teams decide to unite into one team. Later on, Heckmeyer said they simply felt sorry for the guys. And two barely acquainted teams unite into one, putting aside all these competitions between the Austrians and Bavarians. And together, they set out to storm the wall. Heckmeyer and Wurg planned to lead. They had more experience and much better equipment, so Harrer was immediately given extra weight to carry. He was the only one without crampons, so all the heavy items were dumped on him. Joining forces, they began to move at a very good pace. And without much adventure, the climbers passed the Flatiron, the third ice field, and reached a place called the Ramp. The route ahead was unknown. It is important to understand that this route is very difficult, not only because of the relief or the technically difficult sections, but mainly it's difficult because no one had ever been there before. The climbers did not have a kind of key to the ascent. Each new attempt reached a certain point, finding simpler ways to navigate it, and those spots where Tony Kurtz and other climbers had perished, they now passed quite quickly because they knew what to do and had learned from their mistakes. However, the inevitable moment arrived when it became unknown how to proceed further, as no one had ever gone that high before. The place, named the Ramp, was passed with great difficulty. The climbers fell several times, and if not for their belaying, their bodies would have been found somewhere at the foot of the wall. About the Ramp, they encountered a place called the Chimney, very similar to an ice chute, only now it was not covered with ice, but water was gushing down it. They decided to leave this section for the morning, when the water would turn to ice, and began to set up a bivouac. Somehow managing to adopt two ledges, they sat down, anchored themselves with hooks, and began to prepare dinner. They had no appetite. Their dehydrated bodies only demanded fluids. Only Heckmeyer opened and ate a can of sardines, seemingly in vain. In the middle of the night, he was seized by a severe stomach spasm, but by morning, with the help of Harrer, who boiled endless portions of tea one after another, Heckmeyer recovered and was ready to continue the ascent. The chimney, which they called the Waterfall Crack, was covered in ice. Heckmeyer climbed through it, displaying brilliant ice technique and the capabilities of the front points of the new crampons. Next, they had to overcome a 10-meter overhanging ice cliff. Andre Heckmeyer drove in an ice screw for belaying and began to climb. Almost at the top, he fell, but the screw held. The second attempt resulted in a similar outcome. During the third attempt, again at the very top, Heckmeyer, feeling the wall with his hand searching for a hold, felt his feet begin to slip again. The experienced climber threw his hand forward and luckily found a hold. After which he climbed to the top, drove in several reliable hooks, and began to receive the others. From the ramp, they had to move to the right to another large snowfield named the White Spider. This was a large ice field. It was scarred by avalanche chutes and traces of rock falls. Huge stones, snow, and ice, jumping from the spider like from a springboard, flew unimpeded down to the Flatiron and the second field. That's why this wall was so dangerous. And at this time, the weather begins to worsen. Fog descends, and snow starts to fall. The first road team reached the spider and very quickly moved up it in their trendy 12-point crampons. The second rope team found it considerably harder. Kaspberg stepped out onto the ice and began to hew steps for Harrer. Heinrich belayed his partner through an ice screw and suddenly heard the noise of an avalanche falling from above. Harrer reacted instantly and pressed himself against the wall, covering his head with his backpack. And for some reason, I believe that at that moment, Harrer remembered the story of Tony Kurtz and his crew, who were killed by an avalanche. Heinrich pressed as close to the wall as possible and clicked his self-belay device into the screw to prevent being swept away by the snow of the wall. And while he continued to belay Kasparek, he was sure that he was the only one left alive on the wall, and that the other climbers had been carried away by the avalanche. When the series of avalanches ended, Heinrich shouted. To his great relief, it turned out that the entire group had survived this avalanche. Heckmeyer and Wurk were already at the very top of the spider. They had no belay in place, but Andre managed to stick the peak of his ice axe into the ice with one hand, and with the other, he grabbed Wurk literally by the scruff and, hanging on the ice axe, they managed not to fall down. Of all four, Kasparek suffered the most. A stone hit his arm hard and tore off a piece of skin. But this was not considered a fatal injury. Fritz could move independently, which was the most important thing. Another overnight stay awaited the climbers. This time they slept half sitting, half hanging, half standing. Again, they had no desire to eat. Again, endless cups of tea. In the morning, they reached the entrance Crags Rocks. This meant that they were facing the last serious section before reaching the summit ridge. The climbers realized that today they would either reach the summit or perish, for they had no strength left for descent. Before the final assault, they threw all the food and excess items out of their backpacks to lighten them. Heckmeyer led as usual. Injured Kasparek was placed forward in case they needed to pull him up at difficult spots. Small avalanches constantly descended from the upper snowfields and Heckmeyer had to climb in bursts, picking calm intervals and trying to hold onto the wall while snow streams broke off. Once, an avalanche knocked him off the wall, but the hook held and they hung on the belay. Then the pivotal moment arrived. From somewhere above they heard voices, but they decided not to shout back, as their cries could be mistaken for a call for help, and their ascent might not be acknowledged. It's important to understand that one can easily approach the Eiger via a gentle ridge, and only the north face remained untraversed. So it was clear that friends were already waiting for them at the summit. Due to the fog and snow, the observers hadn't seen them for a day and their friends below were very worried. The climbers ascended very slowly, but continued moving upward. A new series of shouts came from above. They even recognized the voices of their friends. The cries were much closer than the climbers expected, meaning they had very little left to go. By noon, Heckmeyer climbed onto the sub-summit icefield. Another hour and a half later, the entire quartet moved up it. And despite the summit being extremely close, they proceeded very slowly and cautiously, belaying through hooks. Everyone remembered Tony Kurtz's fatal mistake, and nobody wanted to repeat his fate. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they reached the coveted summit. This dreadful wall, which had claimed the lives of so many climbers, was finally conquered, meaning the last unsolved problem in the Alps was resolved. There were no more unconquered walls left. Friends greeted the climbers at the summit. This was very timely, as Andre was literally losing consciousness from exertion. It was Andre Heckmeyer who had led the way the entire route, which is the hardest work. The choice of route, all the technical work, and in general the feasibility of this ascent were largely due to his merit. It might seem that the wall was conquered and that could be the end of the story about these heroic climbers. But then, the most interesting part begins. After a short rest, Fritz Kasparek took out a flag with a swastika from his backpack and set it up on the summit. The Bavarians later claimed that they were unaware of such a performance. When interviewed by journalists later, Heckmeyer and Harrer emphasized that there was no political motive in their actions. Yes, they answered journalists. Work received subsidies from the Reich Ministry of Education and Sports. These subsidies partially compensated from the expenses on equipment. But at the same time, Heckmeyer repeatedly declined similar offers, as he highly valued his independence. And one can assume that especially Heckmeyer, who obviously had no sympathies for fascism, did not like these political games and just wanted to get through this wall. Once they descended, the climbers immediately became national heroes and practically superstars. Of course, such a high-profile news event as we say now could not be ignored by propaganda. And in my opinion, the ascent by Fritz Kaspberg and Heinrich Harrer initially had a political subtext. The participants later preferred to remain silent about these affairs and practically did not tell anything about it. And I allow myself to assume that Fritz Kaspberg, who was one of the first to join the ranks of the stormtroopers, had some influence on Heinrich Harrer. Fritz Kaspberg was in the SS ranks practically since the creation of this organization. It is quite possible that he convinced Heinrich to also join their ranks to politicize this ascent. And one might even speculate that, seeing his love for the mountains, he promised him, besides all the rewards and honors, one very important opportunity. The opportunity to get into the truly high mountains of the Himalayas, which in those years were still practically inaccessible to ordinary mortal climbers, and only state expeditions could get there. One way or another, Heinrich Harrer joined the ranks of the SS 2 months before climbing the Eiger and completed this route already with the rank of the Oberscharführer. Of course, no one will ever know the truth, but in my view, the Austrians set up Heckmeyer, who had no intention of getting involved in all these political games. And this affair did not end simply with newspaper headlines about how the Wehrmacht soldiers, like true superhumans, conquer any peaks. A week after their ascent, all 4 climbers were invited to a reception with Adolf Hitler, who presented each with his own autographed portrait in the Olympic medals from 1936. German propaganda fully utilized this story as a triumph of the German athlete and the German military. However, Heinrich Harrer only spent a few months in Germany after this climb. His primary work in the SS was teaching what he truly knew, namely high-altitude mountaineering. He trained the Edelweiss division. A few months later, he received the promised reward and became a member of the German Himalayan expedition. Mountaineering was a sport that received special attention in Nazi Germany. There is also a very popular version that the 1939 German Himalayan expedition, which officially aimed to attempt to climb the 8,000er Nanga Parbat, was actually organized by Himmler's personal decree and went there in search of the mystical land of Shambhala. Either way, Heinrich's dream came true and he made it to the Himalayas. But before continuing the story of Harrer, let's return to his climbing companions. Fritz Kaspberg, of course, went to war. He was assigned the rank of Unterscharführer SS in 1941 and Oberscharführer SS in 1944. Kaspberg was captured by the Allies and was convicted. Until 1951, he was in a camp. He died in 1954 in the mountains. A huge snow cornice collapsed on him near the summit of Salcantay in Peru. Bavarian mountaineer Ludwig Würg died in combat on the first day of Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, June 22, 1941. In my view, the leader of the Eiger ascent was Heckmeyer. He was burdened by the fame that fell upon him and even avoided public appearances. He also turned down numerous forced offers, particularly about joining the National Socialist Party. He did not pursue a career, although there were many opportunities. After the war, he worked as a guide in Bavaria, climbed in the Alps, the Andes, and the Himalayas. He became one of the initiators of the German Association of Professional Mountain and Ski Guides in 1968. He died on February 1, 2005, at the age of 98. Almost until his death, he worked as a guide and went to the mountains. Now let's return to the Himalayas, to the 1939 German expedition to Nanga Parbat. That year, they failed to reach the summit. However, the climbers established a new route to the Timor face, which greatly helped in subsequent ascents. In August 1939, the expedition was finished and waiting for a ship in the port of Karachi to return to Germany. But on September 1, 1939, World War II began. On September 3, 1939, Britain entered the war, and the German climbers found themselves in enemy territory, where they were quickly arrested and placed in a camp. The climbers learned that Germany had started the war from the English, who had arrested them. After their team ended up in the internment camp located in the foothills of the Himalayas, Harrer's route for escape through the mountain passes into Tibet became clear, and it was there that he received a letter from his wife. In this letter, his wife asked for a divorce, necessary for her to remarry. The prisoners made several escape attempts until one finally succeeded. On April 29, 1944, Heinrich Harrer and 3 other prisoners managed to escape. However, only 2 decided to head towards Tibet. It took him and his companion 20 months to reach Tibet. This was the only path to salvation, which was impossible for everyone except experienced mountaineers. After overcoming an incredibly challenging and lengthy route through the Himalayas, which took the mountaineers almost 2 years, Heinrich Harrer and his partner, Peter Aufschneider, another fascinating figure worthy of his own feature, reached the Tibetan city of Lhasa in February 1946. Lhasa, the sacred city that had been closed to ordinary mortals for centuries, was the residence of the Dalai Lama, the living embodiment of Buddha. It's hard to imagine the impression Lhasa made on the mountaineers. Initially, they planned to escape further to Japan and from there return to Austria, but the war was lost, Germany was defeated, and there was nowhere to return to. Tibet captivated them for many years. Upon arriving in Lhasa, they settled in a shed in the yard of a wealthy townsman who took pity on them and provided shelter. Heinrich Harrer worked as a gardener and his friend as an engineer. One day, the Dalai Lama, then a 10-year-old king god, looked down from his palace and saw Heinrich Harrer teaching Tibetans how to ice skate. To the Tibetans, this sport was new, and they called it walking on knives. Naturally, the young Dalai Lama couldn't miss such an amazing fun. This is how Heinrich Harrer and the Dalai Lama first met. In time, Heinrich became a government official, responsible for translating foreign news and leading a flood control project. He received a salary, a house, a stable, and several servants. Gradually, Harrer became the Dalai Lama's tutor. Harrer was 37 years old at the time, and his student was only 14. He taught him various subjects, from Soviet politics to how a jet engine works. The young Dalai Lama was a very diligent student. For example, Harrer wrote in his book that when he asked him to translate 10 sentences, the Dalai Lama usually translated 20. They constantly discussed Buddhism and Western science. Thus, Heinrich spent 7 years in Tibet, becoming almost friends with the Dalai Lama.
And clearly, not only did Harrer teach the young incarnation of Buddha about what was happening beyond the palace walls, the encounter and this communication changed Heinrich himself beyond recognition. In addition to his work at the palace, Heinrich Harrer began to collect ethnographic material about Tibet. He made numerous high-quality photographs and gathered incredible material about this closed country, about which very little had been known before. To this day, Heinrich Harrer is one of the major researchers of Tibet, and undoubtedly, this was a unique case when a European communicated so closely and for so long with the supreme leader of Buddhism. After these 7 years, Heinrich had become a completely different person. He wore Tibetan clothes, performed some of their rituals, and had fully integrated into the culture. Perhaps he would have stayed at the court for the rest of his days. But in 1951, China invaded Tibet. The world around Heinrich Harrer began to crumble again, and again he was forced to flee, this time to India. And Heinrich Harrer left Tibet shortly before the Dalai Lama himself had to flee and seek asylum in India. It's important to note another fact. Heinrich Harrer, so to speak, did not publicize his membership in the SS and presented himself as a regular German mountaineer. According to the 14th Dalai Lama, he only learned of Harrer's service in the SS many years later from the press. In 1951, from India, Harrer finally returned home to Austria, where he wrote the book 7 Years in Tibet. As I've already said, very little was known about Tibet, but it was a place of great interest and allure. The book was translated into 53 languages and published numerous times. Later, he would write another short story about the ascent of the Eiger's North Face. The book is called The White Spider, and the two is quite good. After returning to Austria, Heinrich lived the life of a successful writer and researcher until the 1990s, when Hollywood decided to make a film based on his book 7 Years in Tibet, starring Brad Pitt as Harrer. And here begins a new twist in our story. During the filming of the movie, journalist Gerald Lehner from Salzburg obtained documents in Washington taken from the state archives in Berlin after World War II. In these documents was found Heinrich Harrer's marriage application, which stated that he was a member of the SS. An incredible scandal erupted. According to Harrer himself, he joined the SS to expedite his marriage. His fiancée had connections with the Nazi elite, and it was, so to speak, unseemly for her to marry a non-party member. It is unclear whether this was a Hollywood publicity stunt to promote the film, or the story just happened to be uncovered, but Heinrich Harrer had to hurriedly look for justifications. Here is the comment he gave to journalists. "Yes, I was a member of that organization, but I only wore the SS uniform once, on my wedding day. Membership there was a big mistake, but I just had to smile and endure. However, the party membership turned out to be a pass to Nangam Parbat. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken me." What is youthful opportunism or blind determination to achieve sporting goals? In any case, it was a big mistake. And for the second time, Heinrich got entangled in a story with propaganda and again let people down. This time, Communist China did not miss the chance to accuse the Tibetans and personally the Dalai Lama of ties with the Nazis. The story still surfaces periodically, suggesting that the Tibetans supported the Nazi regime. However, it should be noted that the 14th Dalai Lama never renounced his friendship with Heinrich Harrer, and despite the Austrian being a full 22 years his senior, the Dalai Lama always called him his friend. For many years, they often met and talked, even in their old age. Even when the ascent story surfaced, the Dalai Lama told his friend that if his conscience is clear, then he has nothing to fear. And in 2002, he thanked him for his contribution to the struggle for Tibet's freedom. Returning to Austria, Heinrich Harrer continued to travel. He visited the Andes, Alaska, Africa, Papua New Guinea, and many other countries. He met with the Singu Indians in Brazil's Mato Grosso, with the inhabitants of the bush and Suriname. He escaped death due to a terrible fall from a waterfall in New Guinea and survived an almost fatal bout of malaria. And in 1958, Heinrich Harrer took up golf and became the Austrian amateur champion. At the age of 85, he was still actively skiing and mountaineering. The mountaineer and explorer Heinrich Harrer died on January 7, 2006 at the age of 93. And one more thing, Hollywood, as facts about Heinrich Harrer's past emerged, immediately distanced itself from him. And as they say now, he was cancelled. Heinrich Harrer wasn't even invited to the American premiere of the film 7 Years in Tibet. And for me, the story is not about mountaineer sports achievements, Nazis, or Buddhists. It's a story about a person, about his mistakes, and about his spiritual growth, which he achieves precisely through these mistakes. It's about a guy who tried by any means to achieve success. And I would like to end this story with a quote from the book 7 Years in Tibet. "Wherever I live, I will always miss Tibet. I often feel as though I can still hear the cries of the wild geese and cranes, the noise of their wings when they fly over Lhasa in the poor and cold moonlight. And to me, this is one of the most amazing biographies I've come across."